If I get pregnant, I'm an up-and-coming actress. I need to snap back fast. So you are required to pay for it. These weren't the words of a duchess. These were the words of Meghan Markle, spoken to Trevor Engelson, the man who knew her long before the titles, the palace gates, and the carefully crafted public image. Trevor Engelson holds memories that don't fit the narrative. Memories from a time before the reinvention, before the cleanup job, before everything changed. Let's talk about what really happened before Meghan became the Duchess of Sussex. Trevor met Meghan back in 2006. They were together for more than 5 years. The kind of years where you see someone at their rawest, most unfiltered. They got married in 2011, a small ceremony in Jamaica. Friends described them as deeply connected, ambitious, building a life together in the entertainment industry. Trevor was a producer. Meghan was hustling for roles, attending auditions, networking at every opportunity. But by 2013, cracks were forming. Meghan had landed a role on Suits, a legal drama filmed in Toronto. The show was her breakthrough, the moment she'd been waiting for. It meant long stretches away from Los Angeles, away from Trevor, away from the life they'd built. On this particular occasion, the distance wasn't just physical. Sources close to the couple at the time say Meghan's focus shifted. The marriage became secondary. Filming schedules took priority. Calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. And then in the summer of 2013, she mailed Trevor his wedding and engagement rings back. No conversation, no closure, just rings in the mail. That's how it ended. A friend of Trevor's revealed years later. One day they were married. The next he was holding a package with his rings inside. For a woman who would later speak publicly about kindness, about treating people with dignity and respect, the method felt cold, calculated, efficient. What many people don't know is what was happening behind the scenes during those Toronto years. Meghan wasn't just filming a TV show, she was building a new identity. The struggling actress was becoming a recognizable face. The woman married to a Hollywood producer was becoming a woman with her own platform, her own following, her own power. And in Toronto's elite social circles, Meghan found a world that fit her ambitions perfectly. Soho House became a frequent haunt. For those unfamiliar, Soho House isn't just a club, it's a network. A place where influencers, creatives, and powerful people connect away from the public eye. Memberships are selective. Privacy is sacred, and for someone like Meghan, hungry to climb, it was the perfect ecosystem. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal a consistent pattern during this period. Meghan attended exclusive gatherings. She networked aggressively. She positioned herself strategically. Friends from her earlier life in Los Angeles noticed the shift. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations were ignored. Old connections were quietly severed. She had a vision board. One former acquaintance said, she had goals written down, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in the way. Toronto insiders remember her as someone who understood the currency of proximity. At parties, she didn't just attend. She worked the room. She knew who mattered and who didn't. She knew which conversations could open doors and which ones were dead ends. This is where the narrative gets more complicated. Whispers began circulating in Toronto's nightlife scene about events Meghan was involved in, not charity galas, not industry mixers, private gatherings with a different purpose entirely, events where reputation and discretion were equally important. Behind closed doors, the tone was far more serious than public appearances suggested. One particular evening stands out in the accounts of those who were present. It was during the time Meghan was dating Prince Harry, though the relationship wasn't yet public. Harry was making discreet visits to Toronto, staying at Meghan's rented townhouse, keeping a low profile. On one of these visits, Meghan hosted what insiders call a run. In Toronto nightlife circles, the term carries specific meaning. It's not a party in the traditional sense. It's a gathering with a particular focus, a particular energy, a particular set of unspoken rules. Sources close to the situation quietly reveal that Meghan wasn't just attending, she was organizing. She moved through the space with confidence, greeting guests, managing the flow of the evening. To those present, it was clear she wasn't a passive participant. She was the architect. What became clear later was deeply unsettling for anyone trying to reconcile this version of Meghan with the woman who would soon join the British royal family. But there's another layer to this story. Princess Eugenie was also present that evening. The daughter of Prince Andrew, herself no stranger to scandal by association, was reportedly at this same gathering. The presence of not one but two people connected to the royal family at such an event raises questions that have never been publicly addressed. Even now, there is no official clarity about what happened that night, who knew what, or how deep the connections ran. But Trevor Engelson knew Meghan before all of this. Before the palace, before the PR team, before the carefully worded statements and the polished interviews. He knew the woman who mailed back wedding rings without a phone call, the woman with the vision board and the ruthless focus, and he stayed quiet. For years Trevor has remained silent while Meghan's star rose higher and higher. That silence, however, doesn't mean absence of knowledge. It means restraint. Patterns don't lie, even when people do. Let's take a moment to understand what actually unfolded during Meghan's transformation from actress to duchess. Long before palace press offices and curated Instagram posts, Meghan had developed a particular skill, the ability to move forward without looking back. Friends, colleagues, entire chapters of her life were quietly closed when they no longer served a purpose. It wasn't dramatic. There were no public confrontations or explosive arguments, just silence. Those who knew Meghan in Toronto described two distinct versions. There was the public-facing Meghan who wrote about feminism on her lifestyle blog, The Tig, who posted about wellness, mindful living and gratitude, who spoke about empowering women and making a difference. And then there was the private Meghan, the one who understood that success in entertainment and high society often required playing by different rules. At that point in time, the situation was already shifting beneath the surface. The parties Meghan attended weren't just social events, they were strategic opportunities. Rooms filled with producers, directors, investors, people who could finance projects or open doors. And in those rooms, relationships were built on mutual benefit, on what you could offer and what you could gain. This moment came after weeks of quiet tension in her marriage to Trevor. The film producer who had supported her career, who had been there through the struggling years, was now in Los Angeles, while she built a new life in Toronto. The distance created space, and in that space, Meghan began to distance herself from more than just her husband. Former friends from her Los Angeles days noticed they were being phased out. Calls went unreturned. Text messages received delayed responses or none at all. Invitations to visit Toronto were politely declined. It was like she decided who fit the new version of herself and who didn't. One former friend explained, and if you didn't fit, you were just erased. Social media accounts were quietly scrubbed. Photos with certain people disappeared. Posts were deleted. The digital trail of her past was being carefully edited in real time. What many people don't know is what was discussed privately during this period. People close to Trevor say he was blindsided by the divorce. One day they were discussing future plans. The next he was receiving legal paperwork and his wedding rings in the mail. There was no gradual separation, no mutual decision, no closure. It was clean, efficient, final. And shortly after the divorce was finalized in August 2013, rumors began circulating that Meghan was dating someone new, someone with a very different level of fame and influence. From this moment onward, nothing followed the usual script. Prince Harry entered the picture in the summer of 2016. The story they would later tell was of a blind date set up by a mutual friend. Two people who had never heard of each other, meeting by chance, falling in love despite the challenges of royal life. But people who tracked Meghan's social circles in Toronto noticed something interesting. She had been moving in spaces where connections to British high society were common. Soho House, where she was a regular, had locations in London. The social network she'd built included people with direct links to the royal family. Many are now questioning how much of their meeting was actually blind chance. Harry made secret trips to Toronto during the early months of their relationship. He stayed at Meghan's townhouse, keeping an incredibly low profile. For a prince whose every move was usually tracked by media, the level of privacy he maintained was remarkable. Observers noted a sharp shift in strategy around this time. Meghan's public persona became even more carefully managed. The Tig, her lifestyle blog where she'd shared personal thoughts and opinions for years, was suddenly shut down in April 2017. No explanation, no farewell post, just gone. Her social media accounts, which had shown glimpses of her life, friendships and personality, went dark. Everything was being locked down, controlled. prepared for a new chapter. Multiple reports point toward the same conclusion. Meghan was being groomed for royal life, but that grooming wasn't just about learning protocol or understanding royal duties. It was about erasing anything that didn't fit the narrative. Anyone who knew too much about the earlier versions of Meghan, anyone who had witnessed the calculated networking, the strategic relationships, the parties that never made it to Instagram, they were quietly distanced. Trevor Engelson, the man who had supported her through years of auditions and rejections, was now someone who couldn't be acknowledged. Their entire relationship, their marriage, became something she rarely mentioned in interviews. When asked about past relationships, Meghan would speak vaguely about learning and growing, about being grateful for experiences that shaped her, but she never named Trevor, never acknowledged the specifics, never explained how a marriage ended with rings in the making. The explanation offered raised more questions than answers. Friends from her Toronto era found themselves in a similar position. People who had been close, who had attended gatherings, who had seen the less polished version of Meghan, were no longer part of her circle. Once the usefulness expired, so did the relationship. A former Toronto acquaintance said, "It wasn't personal, it was strategic, and strategy doesn't leave room for sentiment." This sets the stage for what came next, because the pattern of reinvention didn't stop with her past, it was about to extend into her future as a royal. "I was beautifully surprised when I walked into that room and saw her, and there she was." Prince Harry's words during their engagement interview painted a picture of fairy tale romance. But the story behind their relationship is far more complex than the palace wanted the public to believe. Let's talk about what really happened behind the scenes. As Meghan transitioned from cable TV actress to potential princess, by late 2016, Harry and Meghan's relationship was becoming serious. He was flying to Toronto between royal engagements. She was making quiet trips to London. The secrecy was intentional and carefully maintained. For months the media had no idea the fifth in line to the British throne was dating an American actress, but within certain circles, whispers were spreading. At first glance, this didn't seem unusual for a prince trying to protect a new relationship. Harry had watched his mother hounded by paparazzi his entire childhood. He'd seen how media scrutiny destroyed his parents' marriage. Privacy made sense. Yet sources close to the palace reveal something else was happening simultaneously. A team was quietly working behind the scenes, not just to protect the relationship from media attention, but to investigate Meghan's background. Standard protocol for anyone seriously dating a royal, especially someone who might eventually marry into the family. This context matters for what happened afterward. Palace researchers began compiling information. They looked into her family background, her previous marriage, her social circles, her public statements, and her social media history. They interviewed people who knew her. They reviewed her blog posts, her interviews, her photographs. And according to insiders, they found things that raised concerns. Behind closed doors, the tone was far more serious than the public romance suggested. Senior royal aides reportedly questioned whether Meghan's background and connections were appropriate for someone entering the royal family. There were discussions about her previous marriage and how it ended, questions about her social circle in Toronto, concerns about photographs and posts that had been deleted from social media. But Harry was determined. Friends describe him as completely captivated by Meghan. She represented everything he wanted. Someone from outside the royal bubble, someone who had built her own career, someone who understood media and modern celebrity, someone who seemed to share his values about making a difference in the world. The circumstances leading up to this are important to understand. Harry had spent years feeling trapped by royal protocol. He'd struggled with the expectations, the constant scrutiny, the lack of normal life. He'd dealt with mental health challenges related to his mother's death and the pressure of being a royal. Meghan offered an escape, a partnership with someone who wasn't intimidated by the institution, someone who had her own identity and success, someone who seemed strong enough to handle the pressure. On November 27, 2016, Harry took an unprecedented step. He released a statement through Kensington Palace confirming his relationship with Meghan and condemning the media harassment she was experiencing. It was a bold, emotional statement that revealed just how serious he was about protecting her. The statement described a wave of abuse and harassment, including racial undertones in some media coverage. It positioned Meghan as a victim of unfair treatment, someone being targeted simply for dating. The palace was reportedly unhappy with Harry's decision to release the statement without proper consultation, but it worked. It framed the narrative in Meghan's favor and made critics look like bullies and racists. What followed was not publicly acknowledged at the time. The vetting process that had raised concerns was essentially overridden. Harry's determination to marry Meghan meant that objections from palace staff were pushed aside. The narrative became about a modern prince choosing love over outdated protocols, about the royal family evolving and becoming more inclusive. In November 2017, exactly 1 year after Harry's protective statement, their engagement was announced. The engagement interview became an instant sensation. Meghan wore a white coat and held Harry's hand as they posed for photographers in the sunken garden at Kensington Palace, a location chosen to honor Diana's memory. Inside, they sat for a television interview that would be broadcast around the world. They described their relationship as natural, easy, and meant to be. Meghan spoke about not knowing much about the royal family before meeting Harry. She described it as refreshing to get to know him as just a person, not as a prince. I didn't know much about him, and so the only thing that I had asked her when she said she wanted to set us up was, is he nice? Meghan explained, because if he wasn't kind, it didn't seem like it would make sense. The narrative was perfect. Two people from different worlds finding love against the odds. A modern biracial American woman bringing fresh energy to an ancient institution. But journalists tracking the story began noticing inconsistencies. Meghan's claim of not knowing much about Harry or the royal family seemed odd, given her well-documented interest in Princess Diana. Her blog had posted about Kate Middleton's wedding. She'd posted photos of herself outside Buckingham Palace years before meeting Harry. Small details didn't quite add up. The timeline of how they met had subtle variations depending on which interview you watched. The story of their third date, where Harry allegedly convinced her to join him camping in Botswana, sounded romantic but struck some observers as strategically crafted. The full truth was still emerging, hidden beneath layers of carefully managed public relations, and what would come next would test whether Meghan's reinvention could survive the ultimate spotlight. Life as a working member of the British royal family. The truth has a way of lingering in the shadows, waiting for the moment when silence is no longer enough to contain it. The wedding on May 19, 2018, was a global spectacle. Millions watched as Meghan Markle became the Duchess of Sussex, walking down the aisle of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The ceremony blended British tradition with American culture, gospel choirs with classical music, ancient vows with modern touches. It looked like the ultimate fairy tale, a Hollywood ending in real time. But this was far from the end of the story. Within months of the wedding, reports began surfacing about tensions behind palace walls. Staff members were leaving their positions. Anonymous sources described Meghan as demanding, difficult, someone who sent emails at 5 a.m., expecting immediate responses. The British media, which had initially celebrated the wedding, turned sharply critical. Stories appeared almost daily about conflicts with Kate Middleton, disagreements with palace staff, and complaints about royal protocol. At that point in time, the situation was already fragile. Harry and Meghan's response was to retreat further into their own circle. They distanced themselves from William and Kate, moving from Kensington Palace to Frogmore Cottage. They separated their charitable foundation from the joint one they'd shared with William and Kate. They hired their own communications team, and they began speaking out. In October 2019, Meghan gave an interview during their royal tour of Africa. When asked how she was coping, she teared up. "Not many people have asked if I'm okay," she said. "Thank you for asking, because not many people have asked if I'm okay." The clip went viral. It showed vulnerability, exhaustion, pain. It positioned Meghan as someone struggling under impossible pressure, someone being treated unfairly by both media and institution. But to those who had followed the pattern of her life, it felt familiar. This is where questions began to surface more loudly. People who had known Meghan before the royal chapter began comparing notes. Former friends spoke anonymously to journalists about her tendency to cut people off, to rewrite history, to position herself as a victim when relationships ended. Trevor Engelson's name resurfaced in these discussions. The ex-husband who had been erased from the narrative, who had received divorce papers and wedding rings in the mail without warning, who had been airbrushed out of her story. "She has a pattern," one source told a journalist. "When something or someone no longer serves her purpose, they disappear. And somehow, she's always the victim in the story that gets told." In January 2020, Everything collapsed spectacularly. Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back as senior working royals. The statement was released without consulting the Queen, Prince Charles, or Prince William. It blindsided the family and violated fundamental protocol about coordinating public statements. The Queen released her own statement expressing disappointment but support. Emergency meetings were held at Sandringham. The media called it Meghan's. The coverage was brutal. Within weeks, Harry and Meghan had left the United Kingdom. They stayed briefly in Canada before settling in California, purchasing a multi-million-dollar mansion in Montecito, an exclusive enclave near Santa Barbara. The outcome was quietly decisive. They had extracted themselves from the royal institution while retaining their titles. They had positioned themselves as victims of an racist, outdated system. They had built a narrative of escape from oppression that would become the foundation for their next act, and that next act was extraordinarily lucrative. In September 2020, they signed a deal with Netflix reported to be worth over $100 million. In December, they signed a podcast deal with Spotify worth an estimated $25 million. They launched Arkwell, their nonprofit and media production company. Then came the interview that changed everything. In March 2021, Oprah Winfrey interviewed Harry and Meghan in a primetime special that drew over 17 million viewers in the United States alone. For 85 minutes, they detailed their grievances against the royal family. Meghan claimed someone in the royal family had expressed concerns about how dark their son Archie's skin might be. She said the institution refused to help when she experienced suicidal thoughts. She described feeling silenced, trapped, and unsupported. Harry spoke about feeling cut off financially, about his father stopping taking his calls, about being disappointed by his family's response to the situation. The interview was explosive. It dominated global headlines for weeks. It forced Buckingham Palace to release a statement saying recollections may vary on some points. It divided public opinion sharply between those who saw Meghan and Harry as brave truth-tellers, and those who saw them as selfish, destructive forces. But journalists began digging deeper into the claims. Timelines were questioned. Sources disputed certain details. The specificity of some allegations didn't match palace records. Only later did the true impact become apparent. The interview hadn't just damaged the royal family's reputation, it had damaged Harry and Meghan's as well. Polling showed their popularity plummeting, especially in the United Kingdom. The narrative of victims escaping oppression began to look more like a calculated PR strategy for building a lucrative media brand. Trevor Engelson, who had stayed silent through all of it, became a symbol of something larger. The man who knew Meghan before the reinvention, before the titles, before the carefully constructed image. He represents everyone who was part of her earlier chapters, the friends from Los Angeles, the colleagues from Toronto, the people who witnessed the networking, the ambition, the strategic relationships, the parties that never made Instagram. These people remember, in patterns. As they say, don't lie. What happens next could redefine everything about how we understand this story. Because beneath the titles, the interviews and the multi-million-dollar deals, there's a question that has never been fully